It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had one suitcase, the rolling kind with the broken wheel that pulls to the left. I had packed it in 11 minutes, while my mother-in-law stood in the hallway and my husband stood in the kitchen doorway, and neither of them said the thing that needed to be said. She had told me to get out. He had said nothing. I zipped the suitcase. I carried it down the stairs. I walked past both of them without making eye contact, because eye contact would have cost me something I was not willing to spend in that house. I put the suitcase in my car. I sat in the driver's seat for about 45 seconds. Then I drove away. On Friday morning, 3 days later, my phone rang. My mother-in-law's number. I watched it ring. I watched it go to voicemail. An hour later, my husband called. Voicemail. His sister called twice that afternoon. Voicemail. Voicemail. By Friday evening, there were 11 missed calls between the three of them. I did not call any of them back that day, or the next day, or the day after that, because on Tuesday afternoon, while I was packing that suitcase in 11 minutes, something had shifted in me that I did not yet have words for. I have the words now. This is what happened. All of it. And why those voicemails changed nothing. My name is Sarah. I am 34 years old, and I spent 3 years of my marriage slowly understanding something that took a Tuesday afternoon to finally make undeniable. I need to tell you about the house first, because the house matters. When Daniel and I got married, we moved into his family home. This was presented as temporary, 6 months, maybe 8, while we saved for a deposit on our own place. His mother, Margaret, had the space. His father had passed 2 years earlier. She said she would welcome the company. Daniel said it made financial sense. I agreed because I was 29 and newly married, and I believed that temporary meant temporary. 3 years later, we were still there. I want to be precise about what 3 years in someone else's house does to a person, because I think people who have not experienced it do not fully understand. It is not the dramatic things that wear you down. It is the accumulation of small ones. It is asking before you rearrange the kitchen to find something more easily. It is eating dinner at the time the house has always eaten dinner, regardless of what your own body needs. It is the specific feeling of walking into a room and adjusting yourself, your volume, your posture, your laugh, because the room belongs to someone else, and that someone else is always present. I had adjusted myself for 3 years. Margaret was not a cruel woman in the obvious sense. She did not shout. She was not physically aggressive. What she was, and I say this with the clarity that only distance provides, was a woman who had run her household alone for 2 years after her husband died and had developed, in that time, a very specific understanding of how things should be done. Her way, her timing, her standards, her version of what a home looked and felt and functioned like. I was a variable she had not accounted for. And for 3 years, she had been working, quietly, methodically, to reduce my footprint in that house to something she could manage. Daniel's sister was called Pam. She visited twice a week. She and Margaret had the specific solidarity of 2 women who had known each other their entire lives and had developed a shared language that did not require full sentences. A look between them could communicate an entire position on a subject. I had learned to read those looks the way you learn to read weather, with the understanding that what was coming had already been decided before you saw the signs. And then came the Tuesday. It started over a phone call. I had taken a work call in the living room. This was not unusual. I work in insurance, risk assessment, and my calls are often long and detailed, and I had taken calls in the living room before. The kitchen was too loud in the afternoons. Our bedroom had a window that faced the street, and the traffic noise made it difficult on calls. The living room was quiet and had good signal. Margaret came in while I was on the call. I held up one finger, the universal signal, for 1 minute, and she stood there. I will be honest, the call ran longer than I expected. It was a complex claim review. I was on for 22 minutes. When I hung up, Margaret said, calmly, "This is my living room, Sarah. I would appreciate it if you found somewhere else for your work calls." I said, "I understand. I'll try to use the bedroom." She said, "You'll try?" I said, "I will." She said, "You've been saying things like that for 3 years. Something in her tone was different that day. Not louder, more settled, the tone of someone who has been building toward a conclusion and has arrived at it. She said, "I've been very patient." I said, "I know you have, Margaret, and I appreciate it." She said, "I don't think you do. I don't think you appreciate what it means to share a home with someone who treats it like a hotel." I said, "I don't treat it like a hotel. I live here." She said, "You live here because Daniel brought you here. This is my home. I have run this home for 31 years. The way things work here, the way they have always worked, that matters." I said, calmly, "I understand that, and I have tried very hard to be respectful of that." She said, "Trying is not doing." I said, "Margaret, what would you like me to do differently? Tell me specifically." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I would like you to find somewhere else to live." The room was very quiet. I said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "I would like you and Daniel to find your own place." I should have said this sooner. I've been too accommodating, and it hasn't helped anyone. I said, "That's a conversation for Daniel and me to have together." She said, "I've already spoken to Daniel." I said, "And what did Daniel say?" She said, "Daniel understands." I looked toward the kitchen. Daniel was standing in the doorway. He had been there, I understood, for most of the conversation. I looked at my husband. I said, "Daniel." He said, "Mum has a point, Sarah. Maybe it's time we looked at other options." That was the sentence. Not "I'm sorry," not "let's talk about this," not "I disagree with how this is being handled." Maybe it's time we looked at other options. Said in his mother's house, while his mother stood 3 feet away, about my place in a home I had been living in for 3 years. I nodded. I said, "Okay." I went upstairs. I packed the suitcase in 11 minutes. I drove to my friend Claudia's apartment. Claudia and I have been friends since university. She is the person I call when something is real, and I need someone who will respond to the real thing and not the managed version of it. I had not called ahead. I just drove there. She opened the door and looked at me and the suitcase with the broken wheel, and she said, "Kitchen or bedroom?" I said, "Kitchen." She made tea. I sat at her table, and I told her what had happened in the order it happened, without editorializing, which is the only way I know how to tell things when I am still inside them and do not yet know what they mean. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where is Daniel now?" I said, "At the house, I assume." She said, "Has he called?" I looked at my phone. It had been 2 hours. I said, "No." She didn't say anything about that. She didn't need to. The not saying was its own kind of clarity. I stayed at Claudia's that night. She gave me the room she uses as an office, which had a daybed and a window that looked onto a quiet street. And I lay there in the dark and I thought about the 11 minutes. I thought about the fact that I had packed a suitcase in 11 minutes and left a house I had lived in for 3 years. And my husband had stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Maybe it's time we looked at other options." I thought about what that sentence meant. Not the words, the position, the choosing. In the moment when his mother asked me to leave, and I looked at Daniel, in that specific moment, which was the moment that counted, he had chosen a position. He had chosen it without drama and without apparent conflict, and with the ease of someone stepping into something that had already been decided. He had not chosen me. I did not cry that night. I had expected to, and I did not. What I felt instead was something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. A very clear, very still kind of knowing. I had been making myself smaller in that house for 3 years, and I had told myself it was temporary, and I had believed it because I wanted to believe it. And on a Tuesday afternoon, the temporary had been named as permanent, and my husband had agreed, and that was the actual shape of things. I finally moved the actual shape of things. That was not nothing. Daniel texted at 9:17 Tuesday night. The text said, "Are you okay? Let me know where you are." I read it. I did not respond. I want to explain that choice because I think it is the most important choice in this story, and it is easy to misread. I did not respond because I did not know yet what I wanted to say, and I had learned over 34 years of being a person who tends to manage situations, that saying something before you know what you mean costs you later. It gives the other person a version of events that they can work with before you have decided what the events mean. I was not ready. He texted again at 11. "Everything okay?" At 7 the next morning, "Sarah, please just let me know you're safe." I replied to that one, "I'm safe." That was all. Wednesday, I went to work. I am good at compartmentalizing when I need to be. I needed to be. I sat at my desk and I did my job. And at lunch, I called my mother. My mother's name is Helen. She is 61, and she has an extremely low tolerance for nonsense that is presented as reasonableness, and I knew she would tell me what she actually thought, rather than what she thought I wanted to hear. I told her everything. She was quiet for longer than Claudia had been. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need to know if I'm reading this right." She said, "Yes, you're reading it right." I said, "He said maybe it's time we looked at other options." She said, "In his mother's kitchen," while his mother stood there. "About your home." I said, "Yes." She said, "Sarah, that is not a man who had a bad moment. That is a man who showed you who he is when it counts. The question is what you're going to do with that information." I thought about it. I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's okay. Take your time. You don't have to decide anything right now. But don't go back until you know what you're going back to." That was the most useful thing anyone said to me in those 4 days. Don't go back until you know what you're going back to. Thursday, I spoke to a solicitor. Not because I had decided anything, because I am the kind of person who believes that information is not commitment, and that understanding your options is not the same as choosing one. I called a family law solicitor, someone Claudia knew, and I had a 1-hour consultation, and I came away with a clear picture of where I stood legally. The picture was more solid than I had expected. We had been paying rent to Margaret, a formal arrangement, documented, which Daniel had insisted on when we moved in, because he said it was the right thing to do, and I had agreed. We had a legal tenancy. We had rights in that property that Margaret could not simply dissolve with a conversation in the living room. I had left without knowing that. I had packed a suitcase in 11 minutes because a woman had told me to leave and my husband had agreed with her, and I had not known in that moment that I had rights she could not override. I sat with that information on Thursday evening at Claudia's kitchen table. I sat with it for a long time. Friday morning at 8:42, Margaret called. I watched the phone. I let it ring. Voicemail. At 9:15, Daniel called. Voicemail. At 11, Pam called. Voicemail. At 2:15, Pam called again. Voicemail. At 4, Daniel called twice within 10 minutes. Voicemail. Voicemail. At 6:30, Margaret called again. Voicemail. By the time I went to bed on Friday,
there were 11 missed calls. I had not listened to a single voicemail, not because I was being dramatic, because I had decided that I would know what I needed to know from the pattern of the calls, and the pattern was already telling me something. 11 calls in 1 day from 3 people.
Who 3 days ago had been comfortable enough with my departure to watch me pack and leave. Something had changed between Tuesday and Friday. I did not yet know what. I found out on Saturday. Claudia found out first because Claudia has a friend who knows Pam socially, and information in that particular network moves quickly. She came and sat next to me on the daybed on Saturday morning, and she said, "I know why they're calling." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The boiler. It broke Thursday night. Completely. The whole heating system." I looked at her. She said, "Margaret has been calling the landlord. She owns the house, but there's some kind of shared maintenance agreement with the council for the area. Apparently it's a designated older property, and she can't get anyone out until next week. She called Daniel's uncle, who does plumbing. He doesn't do boilers." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "And?" Claudia said, "And apparently Daniel has been trying to find a solution, and he can't find one, and he's panicking. And I think Margaret is too, because it's going to get cold." I said, "And they're calling me because..." Claudia said, "Because you work in insurance risk assessment, and you have contractor contacts and they know it." I looked at the window. I said, "Ah." She said, "Yeah." I thought about the 11 calls. I thought about how on Tuesday afternoon, Margaret had told me I treated the house like a hotel, and my husband had agreed, and they had watched me leave with my suitcase with the broken wheel, and on Friday, they needed my contacts. I sat with that for quite a long time. I listened to the voicemails on Saturday afternoon. Margaret's was formal, controlled. She said there had been a problem with the heating, and she wondered if I had any professional contacts who might be able to assist. She did not say please. She did not apologize. It was the voicemail of someone who needed something. and was managing the asking. The way they managed everything else, efficiently and without acknowledgement of what it cost. Daniel's voicemails were different. The first one was practical. He explained the boiler situation and asked if I knew anyone. The second was less controlled. He said, "Sarah, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but Mom is 63, and she can't be in a cold house. Please, if you know someone, just let me know." The third, and there was a third, from Friday evening. He said, "Sarah, I've been thinking about Tuesday. I should have said something. I didn't, and I know that, and I'm sorry. Please call me." I listened to that one twice. The "I should have said something, I should have." Not "I'm sorry, I agreed with her." Not "I understand if you're done." I should have said something. Past tense. Observed from a distance. The apology of a man who has identified the problem without fully inhabiting what the problem cost. I thought about what my mother had said. Don't go back until you know what you're going back to. I called a contractor I know. His name is Rob, and I have sent him enough referrals over 3 years of insurance work that he picks up when I call. I explained the situation briefly. He said he could get someone out Monday. I thanked him. Then I sat with the phone in my hand, and I thought about what to do next. I did not call Daniel. I called Margaret. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Margaret, I've sorted a contractor. Someone will be there Monday morning. I'll send you the details by text." She said, "Thank you, Sarah." A pause. I said, "I'd like to come and collect the rest of my things this weekend." Another pause, longer. She said, "Of course." I said, "And I'd like to talk to Daniel, not at the house, somewhere neutral." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'll tell him." I said, "Good. I'll send the contractor details now." I texted the contractor information. And then I sat at Claudia's kitchen table and I made a list. Not of grievances, of decisions. The specific, practical adult decisions that the last 4 days had made necessary. I had always been good at lists. We met at a cafe on Sunday morning. Neutral ground. His suggestion, once Margaret had passed on that I wanted to talk somewhere else. He was there when I arrived. He looked like someone who had not slept well for 4 days, which I registered without satisfaction. Not because I wanted him to have slept well, because his sleeplessness was not the point of what I needed to say, and I did not want to be distracted by it. I sat down. He said, "Sarah, I'm sorry." I said, "Let me talk first. Then you can respond." He nodded. I said, "On Tuesday your mother asked me to leave, and you agreed with her." Not in those words. In the words, "Maybe it's time we looked at other options." But that was agreement. In the kitchen, while she told me to get out of the house I have lived in for 3 years, and you did not say, "This is not how we handle this." You did not say, "Sarah and I will discuss this together." You did not say, "Mom, this isn't your decision to make." You said, "Maybe it's time." He said, "I know." I said, "I need you to understand what that moment meant." It was not about the house. Houses are replaceable. It was about what you chose when you had to choose. And you chose the version of events your mother was presenting rather than standing next to me. That is the thing I am sitting with. He said, "I've been sitting with it too." I said, "For 3 days." He said, "Yes." I said, "I've been sitting with it for 3 years." Every time something happened in that house, and I raised it with you, and you said, "Mom means well," or "Give it time," or "Let's not make this bigger than it is." Every time I adjusted myself to fit a space that was never really made for me, and you called that being flexible. Tuesday was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of 3 years arriving in one afternoon. Daniel was quiet. He said, "I know I've been too slow to see it." I said, "Seeing it now is not the same as having seen it then." He said, "No, you're right." I said, "So here is what I need from you. Not an apology. I believe you're sorry. I need to know what changes. Specifically, not in intention, in behavior. If we go and find our own place, which is what we should have done 18 months ago, what is different about how you handle the moments when your mother's needs and mine are in conflict?" He said, "I choose you." I said, "That's an intention. I need a behavior." He thought about it. He said, "When she raises something about you, about us, I tell her to bring it to both of us or not at all. and if she won't, I leave the conversation. I said, and if she escalates. He said, then I put distance between us until she doesn't. I said, have you ever done that before? He said, no. I said, are you telling me you will now because you believe it, or because you want me to come home? He was quiet for a long moment. He said, both, and I know that's not enough. But I also know that Tuesday was the clearest look I've ever had at what I've been doing, and I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be the man who stood in the doorway. That sentence, the man who stood in the doorway, told me something. It told me he understood what he had done, not approximately, precisely. I said, I need time. I'm not coming back to that house. If we do this, we find somewhere that is ours from the beginning. He said, yes. I said, and I need to see the behavior before I trust the intention. That takes time. He said, I know. Take what you need. I said, I will. We sat there for a few more minutes. We drank our coffee. We did not perform warmth we had not yet rebuilt. The contractor fixed the boiler on Monday. Rob's guy was there at 8:30, done by noon. I know this because Rob texted me when it was finished. I had asked him to. I went to collect the rest of my things on Monday afternoon. Daniel had offered to be there. I said I would rather do it with just Margaret. He looked uncertain. I said she and I need to talk without you in the room. He understood. Margaret let me in. She had made tea. I noticed this. She had made tea before I arrived. That was deliberate, and it cost her something, and I received it. We sat in the kitchen. I spoke first. I said, I'm not going to pretend Tuesday didn't happen, or that the 3 years before it didn't happen. I'm not going to be gracious about it, because I don't think that serves either of us. She held her cup. I said, you built this house, and you ran it, and you know it better than anyone. I understand that having someone come into your space and do things differently is genuinely hard. I don't think you're a bad person, Margaret. I think you love Daniel, and I think that love has a very specific radius, and I wasn't inside it. She said, I was trying to protect my home. I said, I know. And in doing that, you made mine impossible to protect, and Daniel let that happen. She was quiet. I said, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to tell you that going forward, Daniel and I will have our own home, and the decisions about that home will be ours. I hope we can have a relationship. I genuinely do, but it will need to be a different kind than the one we've had. One where I'm a person you talk to, not a problem you manage. She looked at her cup for a long time. Then she said something I had not expected from Margaret, who I had never seen admit anything directly in 3 years. She said, I was afraid. I said, of what? She said, of becoming irrelevant. After Frank died, I had this house and Daniel. And then you came, and the house started to feel like it was changing around me. And I didn't know how to ask for what I needed. So I just held on tighter. I sat with that. I said, I understand that better than you might think. She said, I should have spoken to you, directly, instead of Tuesday. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry for Tuesday. I believed her, not completely, enough to work with. I said, I accept that, and I hope we can do better. She nodded. I collected my things. She helped me carry 2 boxes to the car. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. Daniel and I found a flat 6 weeks after Tuesday. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that is entirely ours, arranged the way we want it, with nobody else's preferences to account for. I have taken calls in the living room 3 times this week, and nobody has appeared in the doorway. It sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. I want to tell you where we are honestly, because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean one. Daniel is different in the way that people are different when a very specific moment has shown them something undeniable about themselves. Not transformed. That would be too strong a word and too convenient a story. Changed in one specific direction. When his mother raises things about our life, and she does, She is who she is. He tells her that those are conversations for Sarah and me. He has done this 4 times since we moved. I know because he tells me every time. He wants me to know that he is doing it. I think that telling me is part of the accountability. I am keeping it. Margaret came to dinner last month. She brought flowers, which she had never done before in 3 years of me living in her house. She sat at our table, and she was, for the first time in my experience of her, a guest. She behaved like a guest. The difference was significant. I am not pretending everything is repaired. 3 years of adjusting myself in someone else's space does not dissolve in a dinner. Daniel and I are in a different place than we were before Tuesday. Better in the specific ways that come from a reckoning that is survived rather than avoided. But the trust I am extending is careful trust, given in portions, watching what is done with it. The 11 voicemails on Friday sit in my memory as a specific kind of data point. On Tuesday, they were comfortable enough to watch me leave. On Friday, they needed something, and they called 11 times. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it with the clarity that comes from having learned what clarity costs and deciding it was worth the price. The voicemails told me something that the Tuesday had not fully told me. They told me what my presence in that house had actually been worth to everyone in it, not in the way they expressed it, but in the way they responded when it was gone. They called 11 times in one day. I let it go to voicemail, not as revenge, as information. I needed to know who they would be when they needed something, and I was not there to provide it. Now I know. If you have ever been the person in the room that everyone assumes will stay, the one who adjusts, who accommodates, who makes the space work for everyone else, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to stop adjusting. You are allowed to pack the suitcase. You are allowed to let the phone ring. And then, from a position of actual clarity, when you know what you are walking back into, you can decide what you want to do next. On your terms, not theirs. That is the part that Tuesday gave me. Not a dramatic ending. A beginning, on my terms. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Would you have answered the phone on Friday? And subscribe if you haven't. More stories here.